The gentle buzz of an old alarm clock pierced the darkness at 4:30 a.m., barely audible over the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. In a small, modest house on the outskirts of rural Georgia, a young boy stirred beneath his thin blanket. The morning air held that special kind of stillness that comes just before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath. Rolling over, he reached out to silence the alarm before it could wake his exhausted mother sleeping in the next room. She'd just returned from her night shift at the local hospital 3 hours ago, and he knew she needed every minute of rest she could get. The floorboards creaked softly under his feet as he tiptoed to the bathroom, guided by the dim blue light of his dollar store nightlight. His morning routine was down to a science by now. Brush teeth, wash face, put on the cleanest school clothes he could find. The bathroom mirror reflected a determined young face, eyes bright despite the early hour. His grandmother always said he had his father's eyes, the same gentle wisdom, the same quiet strength. In the kitchen, he moved with practiced efficiency, making himself a simple breakfast of peanut butter on slightly stale bread. The jar was nearly empty, but he made sure to leave enough for tomorrow. His lunch preparation was equally modest: another sandwich, an apple that was just starting to wrinkle, and a refilled water bottle from the tap. Before leaving, he peeked into his mother's room. She was still in her nursing scrubs, having fallen asleep as soon as she got home. A worn photo on her nightstand showed happier times: his father's bright smile, his mother's carefree laugh, and him, much younger, perched on his dad's shoulders at the state fair. That was before the illness took his father, before the medical bills started piling up, before their car broke down with no money to fix it. Shouldering his backpack, he pulled on his worn sneakers. The right one had a small hole near the toe that let in water when it rained, but he'd learned to position his foot just right to minimize the discomfort. His jacket was thin, but it would have to do. The weather forecast had predicted a chilly morning, but he'd walked through worse. At exactly 5:15 a.m., he stepped out onto the front porch, closing the door carefully behind him. The stars were still visible in the pre-dawn sky, twinkling like distant promises. 5 miles lay between him and school, but he never saw it as a burden. Each step was a step toward education, toward a better future, toward making his parents proud. As he walked down the empty street, his shadow stretched long behind him under the occasional streetlight. Sometimes he'd count his steps. Other times he'd recite his multiplication tables, or practice the speech he was preparing for his social studies class. The neighborhood dogs knew him by now. Old Mr. Johnson's retriever would wag its tail, and the Martinez family's terrier would give a friendly yip as he passed. The morning air was crisp against his face, carrying the scent of pine trees and wet grass. His breath came out in small clouds, dancing in the beam of the flashlight he carried for the darker stretches of road. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every pothole in the street, every shortcut through empty lots that would shave precious minutes off his journey. He never told his mother how early he left, or how long the walk really was. She had enough to worry about, working double shifts just to keep food on the table and the lights on. Besides, he was proud of his independence, proud that he could handle this on his own. In his heart, he knew his father would be proud too. The early morning walk wasn't the hardest part of his day. It was keeping up appearances, making sure nobody at school knew just how tough things were at home. His sneakers were falling apart, held together with determination and a bit of duct tape hidden under the laces. The other kids had new shoes, bright and clean. But he'd learned to walk in a way that kept the holes in his soles from being too obvious. During lunch, he sat at his usual spot near the window, carefully unwrapping his simple sandwich. Around him, other students traded snacks and complained about their mothers packing the wrong chips or forgetting their favorite cookies. He never complained about his lunch. He'd seen his mother skip meals to make sure he had enough to eat. After school, while other kids headed to sports practice or went home to play video games, he found his way to the public library. The librarians knew him well by now. They'd save him a quiet corner spot where he could do his homework under proper lighting, instead of straining his eyes with a flashlight at home to save on electricity. Sometimes they'd slip him a granola bar, pretending they had extra from a staff meeting. The library became his sanctuary until closing time. He'd spend hours there, not just doing homework, but reading everything he could get his hands on. Books about medicine fascinated him the most, maybe because of all those hours spent in hospitals with his father, watching doctors and nurses work their magic, even though in the end, it wasn't enough to save him. When his report card came, showing straight A's, he held onto it all day, waiting to show his mother. She usually slept between shifts, but on report card days, she always made time. Her eyes would light up, tired but proud, and for a moment, the weight of their struggles would lift. "Your father would be so proud," she'd say, and those words meant everything. Some nights, he'd hear her crying softly in her room, looking at bills spread across her bed. He pretended not to notice how she turned down the thermostat when she thought he was asleep, or how she wore the same worn uniform to work day after day. Instead, he found ways to help, learning to mend his own clothes, fixing the leaky faucet with YouTube tutorials, finding the cheapest groceries by comparing prices across stores. The hardest times were when it rained or snowed. His thin jacket wasn't much protection against the elements, but he never missed a day of school. On those mornings, he'd wrap his school books in plastic bags to keep them dry and wear 2 pairs of socks, even though both had holes. Sometimes, kind neighbors would offer him a ride, but he usually turned them down. He didn't want anyone's pity, and besides, his mother had taught him to be careful about accepting rides from strangers. At night, before sleep, he'd often stand at his window, looking out at the stars. He'd think about his father, about the promises they'd made together about his future. College seemed like an impossible dream with their financial situation, but he refused to give up. Every homework assignment completed, every perfect test score, every early morning walk, they were all steps toward keeping that promise. His mother wanted him to be a normal kid, to not worry about adult problems. But how could he not? He saw her sacrifice everything for him. So he did his part, never complaining, always pushing forward. Some days were harder than others, but he remembered what his father used to say. Life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass, it's about learning to dance in the rain. The morning started like any other, with frost coating the ground and his breath visible in the cold air. The sun hadn't even thought about rising yet, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the empty roads. But this particular morning would turn out differently than all the others before it. Officer Wilson was nearing the end of his night shift, doing one final patrol of the neighborhood. He'd been on the force for 15 years, and these quiet morning hours were usually uneventful. That's why the small figure walking along the roadside caught his attention. At first, he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. It wasn't common to see anyone out at this hour, let alone a young boy. He slowed his patrol car, watching as the boy walked with purpose, his backpack bouncing slightly with each step. What struck the officer most wasn't just that the boy was alone. It was how he carried himself, head high despite the cold, like someone much older than his years. The boy's jacket was clearly too thin for the weather, and even in the dim light, the officer could see his shoes were worn nearly through. The officer had seen plenty in his years on the force, some things that hardened his heart, and others that reminded him why he chose this job in the first place. Something about this scene tugged at him in a way he couldn't ignore. He pulled his car over slowly, not wanting to frighten the boy. When he rolled down his window, he noticed how the boy tensed slightly but didn't break his stride. It was the look of someone who had learned to be strong but careful. "Good morning," the officer called out softly. "It's pretty early to be out walking. Everything okay?" The boy stopped, turning to face the car. His expression was a mixture of respect and wariness, the kind of look that spoke of growing up too fast. "Yes, sir," he replied politely. "I'm just heading to school." His voice was clear and steady, but his hands gripped his backpack straps a little tighter. Officer Wilson glanced at his watch. 5:30 a.m. School wouldn't start for another 3 hours. That's quite early for school, he said gently. Mind if I ask where you're walking from? He kept his tone conversational, careful not to sound like he was interrogating. The boy hesitated for a moment, weighing his words. I live on Oak Hill Road, he finally said. The officer knew that area. It was nearly 5 miles from the school. His heart sank a little, thinking about this child walking that distance alone, especially in this weather. How long have you been making this walk? The officer asked, noticing how the boy's shoes were carefully duct-taped at the seams. The answer came quietly but matter-of-factly. Since our car broke down a few months ago. There was no self-pity in his voice, just simple truth. The conversation that followed revealed more than either expected. The officer learned about the boy's mother working night shifts at the hospital, about his father's passing, about the medical bills that made fixing the car impossible. But what touched him most was what the boy didn't say. There were no complaints, no excuses, just quiet determination. As they talked, the sky began to lighten slightly, the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. The officer noticed how the boy kept glancing at his watch, clearly concerned about being late. Here was a child who had taken on adult responsibilities without losing his commitment to education, his respect for others, or his dignity. The officer felt something shift inside him, that familiar feeling that told him he wasn't just witnessing a problem. He was being presented with an opportunity to help. But he also recognized that this wasn't a situation for quick fixes or temporary solutions. This boy and his mother weren't looking for handouts. They were fighting their battles with quiet grace, asking nothing from anyone. The morning sunlight was just beginning to peek through the clouds as the police officer offered the boy a ride to school. At first, the boy politely declined, explaining that he didn't want to be a bother. But when the officer mentioned the incoming cold front, concern for the child's safety won over the boy's reluctance. During the drive, the officer noticed how the boy sat up straight, his backpack held carefully in his lap. The warmth of the patrol car's heater brought color back to his cold, pinched cheeks. As they drove, bits and pieces of his story emerged, not in complaints, but in simple, honest answers to gentle questions. Our car's been sitting in the driveway since September, the boy explained, looking out the window. Mom says the transmission's gone. We got a quote from the mechanic, but his voice trailed off. The officer didn't need him to finish the sentence. He'd seen enough families struggling with impossible choices. Fixing a car or paying for medicine, keeping the lights on or putting food on the table. The boy spoke about his father with a maturity that broke the officer's heart. He was sick for a long time, he said quietly. The doctors tried everything they could. Mom says the insurance helped, but there were still lots of bills. His fingers traced patterns on his backpack as he spoke. She works really hard. Sometimes she picks up extra shifts when someone calls in sick. What struck the officer most wasn't just the hardship this family had endured, but the dignity with which they faced it. The boy described their daily routine matter-of-factly. How he learned to cook simple meals. How he did his homework by flashlight to save on electricity. How he'd become an expert at patching up his clothes with safety pins and thread. I try not to wake Mom up when I leave, he said. She gets home around 1 a.m., and she needs her sleep. Sometimes I leave her notes, just so she knows everything's okay. The officer thought about his own kids, safely driven to school each morning, and felt a tightness in his chest. As they neared the school, the boy mentioned something that made the officer's heart sink further. Winter's actually easier in some ways, he said, adjusting his thin jacket. In summer, it's so hot that by the time I get to school, my clothes are all sweaty. At least now I can wear layers. The casual way he described his challenges made them seem even more poignant. The officer pulled into the school parking lot, still mostly empty this early in the morning. Before the boy could get out, he asked about the mother's schedule, about their typical day. The boy answered honestly, explaining how his mother would sleep until mid-afternoon, then wake up to make sure he got home safely from the library where he did his homework. She'd make dinner if she wasn't too tired, then head back to work for her night shift. She tries to hide it, but I know she's tired all the time, the boy said, his voice carrying a weight no child should have to bear. Sometimes I hear her on the phone with the bill collectors. She thinks I'm asleep, but... He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry all the worries of an adult in a child's shoulders. The officer noticed how the boy's shoes, despite being carefully cleaned, were worn through at the soles. Halp's jacket, though neatly mended, was far too thin for the winter weather. But what he noticed most was the boy's unwavering spirit. No complaints, no self-pity, just quiet determination to help his mother and honor his father's memory through his dedication to education. As the boy thanked him for the ride and stepped out of the car, the officer made a decision. This wasn't just going to be another sad story he carried home after his shift. Something had to be done, and he knew exactly where to start. Back at the police station, Officer Wilson couldn't shake the image of that brave young boy from his mind. After finishing his shift paperwork, he sat down at his computer and began typing. He wanted to share this story, not to embarrass the family, but to show how strength and dignity could exist in the face of tremendous hardship. His social media post was simple and respectful. This morning, I met one of the most remarkable young people I've ever encountered in my 15 years of service. He described the 5-mile walks, the dedication to education, the silent struggles of a family doing their best to hold things together after losing a father. He was careful to protect their privacy, focusing instead on their spirit and determination. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Local news stations began calling the police department, asking to hear more about the story. Community members flooded the comments section, all asking the same question: how can we help? A local news reporter approached the story with particular sensitivity. Instead of sensationalizing their struggles, she focused on the broader issues facing working families in their community. The mother was initially hesitant to be interviewed, but when she understood how their story might help others, she agreed to share their experience. The television segment aired during the evening news. The camera captured the worn-out car in their driveway, the boy's carefully mended school uniform, the night shift badge still hanging from his mother's nurse's scrubs. But it also captured something else: the quiet dignity of a family that refused to give up, the love between a mother and son who supported each other through the toughest of times. People watching at home were moved to tears. Phone calls started pouring into the news station. A retired teacher recognized the boy from the library where she volunteered. She'd often seen him studying there, but had never known his full story. The owner of a local diner remembered the mother from her occasional late-night coffee stops during her breaks, always polite despite her obvious exhaustion. The community's response wasn't just emotional, it was practical. A local auto repair shop owner watched the segment and immediately called the station. "I lost my father when I was young too," he said. "My mom worked double shifts to keep us going. I know what that's like. Let me fix their car. No charge." Other offers of help began flooding in. A winter clothing drive was organized by the local church. The school's parent-teacher association started a fund to help with basic necessities. But what touched the family most was how people offered help with dignity, not as charity, but as neighbors supporting neighbors. The local bus company reviewed its routes and realized a small detour could serve not just this family, but several others in their neighborhood who might be struggling with transportation. The change would cost the company little, but would make a huge difference to many families. The mother was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. During a follow-up interview, she wiped away tears as she explained how she'd been trying so hard to handle everything alone. "I didn't want anyone to know how hard things were," she admitted. "I was afraid people would judge us, or worse, try to separate me from my son. But instead, they've shown us nothing but kindness." The boy's school principal spoke about how this situation had opened many eyes. We have programs for free lunches and school supplies, she said, but sometimes families face challenges we don't see. This has taught us to look deeper, to reach out more, to create better support systems for all our students. What started as one officer's compassionate observation had grown into something much bigger. A community coming together, recognizing that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never ask for help, and understanding that true community means making sure no one has to walk their journey alone. The local mechanic's shop was busy on a Saturday morning when the tow truck brought in the family's old car. The mechanic had seen a lot of vehicles in his 30 years of work, but something about this one touched his heart. It wasn't just a broken-down car, it was a symbol of a family's struggles and determination. "Let's see what we've got here," he said, popping the hood. The mother stood nearby, wringing her hands nervously. Her son stood close to her, both of them watching as the mechanic inspected the vehicle. Years of maintaining the car on a tight budget had taken their toll. The transmission wasn't the only problem. The brakes needed work, the timing belt was worn, and several other issues needed attention. Instead of listing everything wrong, the mechanic smiled warmly. "Nothing we can't fix," he said confidently. "My team and I will have this running better than new." He pretended not to notice the tears in the mother's eyes when he refused to accept payment. "The community's got your back on this one," he said simply. Word spread through the town's business community. A tire shop offered to donate a new set of tires. An auto parts supplier provided the needed parts at no cost. Even the mechanic's teenage apprentice stayed late after his shift, wanting to be part of something bigger than himself. While the car was being repaired, other forms of support poured in. The local department store delivered winter coats, boots, and school supplies. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of new shoes. No duct tape needed. His mother tried to decline, saying it was too much, but the store manager insisted. "We're not just a business," she said. "We're part of this community." The fundraiser organized by community members exceeded everyone's expectations. People donated what they could. Some gave $5, others gave more. But every contribution came with messages of support and encouragement. The organizers were careful to set up the fund in a way that protected the family's dignity and privacy. A financial advisor volunteered to help the mother create a budget and plan for the future. He worked with her to understand their medical bills and found programs that could help reduce the debt. "You're not alone in this anymore," he told her, showing her options she never knew existed. The local bus service made good on their promise, adjusting their route to include more stops in underserved neighborhoods. The boy's early morning walks would soon be a thing of the past, but the determination and strength he showed would never be forgotten. What touched the family most was how people helped without making them feel like charity cases. The support came with respect and understanding. When the mother tried to find ways to repay everyone's kindness, people simply asked her to help others when she could, in whatever way she could. One evening, as the boy worked on his homework at their kitchen table, with proper lighting this time, there was a knock at the door. The mechanic stood there, car keys in hand. "She's all ready," he said proudly. The mother began to tear up again, but these were different tears than the ones she shed alone late at night. The car wasn't just repaired, it was transformed. New tires, fresh paint, even the small dent in the passenger door had been smoothed out. The mechanic showed them the work he'd done, explaining everything clearly. "I've taught my own son everything I know about cars," he said to the boy. "If you're ever interested in learning, you're welcome at my shop anytime." As they stood in their driveway, looking at their restored car, the mother hugged her son close. For the first time in months, her work uniform wasn't quite so wrinkled. She wouldn't have to take 3 buses to get to her shift tonight. The boy looked up at her and smiled, seeing hope replace exhaustion in her eyes. This was more than just fixing a car or providing winter clothes. It was about a community coming together to lift up a family who had been silently carrying their burdens alone for too long. It was proof that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person noticing, one person caring, and others following that lead. The difference in their lives became apparent in small but meaningful ways. The mother no longer had to rush from one bus to another between shifts. With reliable transportation, she could finally adjust her work schedule. The hospital administrator, who had always admired her dedication, helped her move to more reasonable hours. For the first time in months, she could have dinner with her son before heading to work. Their evening routine transformed. Instead of the quiet darkness they'd grown used to, their small house now hummed with life. The boy sat at the kitchen table, working on his homework under proper lighting while his mother prepared dinner. No more flashlights, no more worry about the electricity bill. The fundraiser had helped them catch up on utilities and create a small safety net. How was school today? She'd ask, stirring a pot of soup that actually had fresh vegetables in it. Their grocery trips were different now. No more counting pennies or having to choose between bread and milk. The boy would share stories about his day, his voice animated in a way she hadn't heard since his father was alive. The medical bills that once covered their kitchen table were now organized in a neat folder. The financial advisor had helped them work out a manageable payment plan and found programs to reduce the debt. Each month, when his mother made a payment, she felt a little more of the weight lift from her shoulders. One evening, while helping with dishes, the boy noticed something different about his mother. The constant worry lines on her forehead had softened. She was humming, actually humming, while drying plates. It was an old song his father used to sing, one they hadn't heard in their house since he passed. "Mom," he said carefully, "you seem happier." She paused, dish towel in hand, and smiled. It wasn't the tired smile he'd grown used to, but a real one that reached her eyes. "I am, sweetheart," she replied. "I forgot what it felt like to not be scared all the time." The change wasn't just at home. At school, the boy's teachers noticed a difference too. He was still the same dedicated student, but now he had more energy, more focus. No more falling asleep in class after long morning walks. His new shoes meant he could join the running club he'd always watched from afar. His classmates, who never knew about his early morning journeys, now saw him as the fast runner who helped others improve their pace. The laptop donated by a local business meant he could work on assignments at home. The internet connection, paid for the first year by the community fund, opened up a world of learning. He discovered online courses about medicine, remembering how the doctors had tried to save his father. Each night, after finishing his homework, he'd spend time learning about human anatomy, diseases, and treatments. His dream of becoming a doctor didn't seem so impossible anymore. His mother found her own kind of healing too. With more predictable hours, she could attend grief counseling sessions at the local community center. She met other single parents there, forming friendships that helped her realize she wasn't alone. They shared stories, advice, and sometimes just sat together in understanding silence. The change wasn't about having more things. It was about having room to breathe, to hope, to plan for tomorrow instead of just surviving today. The boy still woke up early, not to walk to school, but to help make breakfast. Sometimes they'd sit together at their small kitchen table, watching the sunrise through their window, talking about their plans for the future. One morning, as his mother drove him to school in their restored car, they passed the spot where Officer Wilson had first stopped to help. The boy pointed it out, and they both fell quiet, remembering. That spot on the road had become more than just a place. It was where their lives had begun to change, where they'd learned that it was okay to accept help, that strength sometimes meant letting others in. His mother reached over and squeezed his hand. The early morning light caught the tears in her eyes, but they were different tears now. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of knowing that while life wasn't perfect, they weren't walking their path alone anymore. The story of the boy and his mother sparked something in their small town. It wasn't just about one family anymore. It had grown into a movement that touched many lives. The police department started a new program called Community Eyes and Hearts, encouraging officers to look deeper when they noticed something unusual during their patrols. Officer Wilson's simple act of stopping to help had created ripples throughout the community. At a town hall meeting, residents began sharing stories they'd never told before. An elderly man spoke about struggling to get to his doctor's appointments. A single dad talked about juggling 3 jobs to keep his kids in school. These weren't just stories anymore. They were calls to action. The local mechanic who'd fixed the family's car started offering free basic maintenance classes on weekends. Sometimes, a little knowledge can prevent big problems, he'd say. His shop became a gathering place where people learned not just about cars, but about helping each other. He made sure to include lessons on how to spot problems early, before they became too expensive to fix. The school system made changes too. They started a transportation survey, identifying students who might need help getting to school. The morning bus routes were adjusted, picking up kids from areas they hadn't served before. Teachers began keeping extra supplies in their classrooms, making them available without drawing attention to students who needed them. The library, where the boy had spent so many afternoons studying by proper light, created a new after-school program. They set up study areas with computers and tutors, making sure 1 year had passed since that cold morning when Officer Wilson first stopped his patrol car. The boy now sat in his classroom, his perfect attendance record still intact, but for very different reasons. His latest report card showed straight A's, particularly high marks in science and biology. His teachers had noticed his special interest in medical subjects and helped nurture that passion. After her shift at the hospital, the mother now attended evening nursing classes twice a week. She'd been inspired by her son's dedication to learning and her own experiences in healthcare. Her coworkers covered her shifts when needed, remembering how she'd done the same for them countless times before. The hospital had even offered her a scholarship program for further education. Their small house had transformed, too. The kitchen table where they once sorted overdue bills now held textbooks, hers for nursing school, his for advanced science classes. Photos of his father still held places of honor on the walls, but now they were joined by new memories. Pictures of community celebrations, his science fair victory, her first college assignment marked with an A. The old car that had once sat broken in their driveway now ran smoothly, taking them to school, work, and occasional weekend trips to visit relatives they hadn't been able to see before. The mechanic had taught the boy basic maintenance skills, and together they changed the oil and checked the fluids regularly. These simple moments of learning and caring for their car became special times between them. During career day at school, the boy stood proudly at the podium, sharing his dream of becoming a doctor. He spoke about watching the medical team care for his father, about learning the importance of healthcare, and about how community support had shown him that big dreams were possible. In the audience, his mother wiped away tears of pride, still wearing her nursing scrubs from her morning shift. The community fund they had benefited from was now helping other families. The mother and son often volunteered at fund events, sharing their story to remove the stigma of asking for help. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is reach out, the mother would say, remembering her own journey from silence to strength. Officer Wilson had become a regular visitor to their home, stopping by to check on them and share news about the community programs that had grown from their story. He'd watch the boy explain complex medical terms he'd learned, smiling at how a simple act of kindness had helped unlock such potential. The running club the boy had joined was now organizing charity runs to support the community fund. He led the team not just in speed, but in spirit, always encouraging new members, remembering how it felt to watch from the sidelines. His mother came to every race, cheering from the finish line, her nursing textbooks tucked in her bag for studying between events. Their story had become more than just a tale of hardship overcome. It was a reminder of how communities could transform when people chose to truly see each other. Other towns had started similar programs, creating networks of support that crossed city lines and broke down barriers of pride and isolation. On quiet evenings, the mother and son would sometimes sit on their front porch, watching the sunset. They'd talk about the future, his dreams of medical school, her progress in nursing classes, the ways they hoped to help others once they reached their goals. The weight of survival that had once pressed so heavily on their shoulders had been replaced by the warmth of possibility. "Dad would be so proud of us," the boy said one evening, looking up at the first stars appearing in the sky. His mother hugged him close, knowing it was true. They had honored his memory not just by surviving, but by helping create a community where no one had to walk alone in the dark. Their journey had shown that while life's challenges might bend us, they don't have to break us. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in carrying our burdens alone, but in allowing others to walk beside us, lighting the way forward, one step at a time.